Okay, take two. Let's see if this works better. So, again, welcome everybody. Happy Thursday. I hope you're having a good week. The topic for today's stream is going to be working with JavaScript injection in the content editor web part. This is a topic that's probably more applicable to people working with on-premises versions of SharePoint. So 2013, 2016, 2019. I mean, you could even do this with 2007. But you can do this in certain cases with SharePoint Online. I will be doing demos in SharePoint Online, and I'll talk about what you can and can't do. But in SharePoint Online, in most cases, probably SharePoint Framework is a better way to go than using this technique. But it is available to you, or if you already have existing customizations that use JavaScript injection with the content editor or script editor web parts, this would be a good intro to give you an idea of how those things potentially were built. All right, so let me switch over to my demo screen. Let's assume I can find my mouse. There we go. All right, so this is a classic site in one of my SharePoint developer tenants. So if you have a classic site collection, it automatically supports working with the content editor web part. Okay, and I also have here a modern site collection, a modern team site. A site collection that was created using the modern team site template. Okay, now this can support working with the content editor web part, but it doesn't natively do so. So let me open up a different site collection that was created using the same template. And let me go to the pages library. And to do this, I'm going to need to create a new web part page. So under new, I'll select web part page. And I'll give the page a name. We'll just call it test in this case. And I'll put this in the site pages library and then click create. And then I'll choose add a web part. And then over here under categories, I'm going to choose media and content. And you notice that the content editor web part is not available here in the web part gallery. Okay. So if you have a modern team site and you want to use the content editor web part, you need to enable custom scripts in that site. And that can be done in one of two ways. Actually, I'm just going to show you the one way. I'll show you it by site collection. So if you go to the SharePoint documentation, so docs.microsoft.com/SharePoint, or just do a search using your favorite search engine for SharePoint Online, allow or prevent custom script, you'll get to this article. All right. So this article talks about how to configure custom scripts at the tenant level using the SharePoint Online Admin Center. There's a couple options in there. And it also shows you how to do this at the site collection level using the SharePoint Online Management Shell. Okay, so in the SharePoint Online Management Shell, once you connect to the site collection, you can use this switch, deny, add, and customize pages 0. So basically, you're turning the deny off, right? The deny of using custom scripts is on by default. This command is turning it off. And then once you do that, actually, you'll do that and you have to wait, I don't know, half an hour-ish maybe an hour, or sometimes even more, depending on really sort of how taxed Azure is at the time. Then you'll see in your modern team site the ability to use the content editor web part. So again, the page you're looking for is the one that's called Allow or Prevent Custom Script. It's part of the SharePoint documentation. Okay, so this modern team site has been configured to allow custom scripts, so I can use the content editor web part here. And as I mentioned, any classic site collection just natively has the ability to use the content editor web part. Okay, so I'll do the demos in the modern site collection, the one that was created using the modern team site template. Oh, sorry, just moving before I get to this demo. Excuse me. I haven't tried it. I don't think you can do this in a communication site. The easiest way to do it is just create a communication site, enable custom script, and just see if the content editor web part is available. Actually, I don't even think the web part page, the ability to create web part pages is there. So let's just say I'm pretty sure that you can't do this in a communication site, right? So it's either a site collection that was created using the classic team site template or the modern team site template. All right, so let's go to the pages library, and I will create a new page. So I'm going to create a web part page, and I'll call this Twitch demo. And I'll just have one web part zone, and I'll put it in the site pages library. Okay, and then I'll click add a web part. And then under media and content, one of the options is the content editor. That's the one that's at the top. It's highlighted, and that's the one we want. You could do a lot of the stuff I'm doing using the script editor web part, which is the second from the bottom. I prefer the content editor web part, but if you like the script editor web part, you can apply a lot of the stuff I'm talking about there as well. All right, so I'll choose content editor, and then I'll go ahead and click add. Okay. Now, in the content editor, you can actually put the content in the web part using this link here. Click here to add new content. So you can just like type content in there. All right. If you're just doing markup, so, you know, div tags or titles or paragraph tags or whatever, then that's fine. But if you're putting code in there, I highly recommend that you use a second technique, the one I'm going to be using throughout this demo, which is instead of having the content added in the web part itself, you link the web part to a file that contains what you want to show in the page. Okay, and we're gonna use that technique. So let me just open up the site contents here in a new tab, and let's go to the site assets library. You don't have to put it in the site assets library. That's just a place that I like to put this stuff. And then I'll create a new folder. We'll call this Twitch demo. And then in this folder, we'll add in an HTML file. Okay. And then we're going to link the content editor web part to the HTML file that we're going to put into this folder. All right, so I have Visual Studio Code open here. It's just open to an empty folder. So let's go ahead and create a new file. And we'll call this file twitchdemo.html. And then let's just put a div tag. And let's put the contents of that div to be hello world. Okay, and go ahead and save that. All right, so there is the file I just created here in File Explorer. So I'll just grab the path to the folder containing that file. I'll come back to SharePoint. I'll do an upload, files, and I will navigate to the folder containing the file I just created. I will select it. I'll click open. And now that file is in my SharePoint site. Now I'll come back to the web part page. Actually, let me just grab the URL to the site assets library. Okay, so I'll put that on the clipboard. And then in the content editor, I'm going to open up the web part property pane. And the property I want to set is this one called content link. So I'm going to link this web part to that file. Okay, so it's the URL to the site assets library / Twitch demo was the folder I created. / and then twitchdemo.html is the file. And before I close the property pane, I'm just going to turn off the Chrome so we don't get that content editor text hovering above our web part. So I'll set the Chrome to none. And then, oh, sorry, let me see if I can just resize the page here. Yeah, so in the appearance part section, I changed the Chrome type value to none. And then let's go ahead and click OK. All right, so then I'm going to click Stop Editing. And I'm just going to clear out the query string because if I try to refresh this page, it's going to ask me if I want to resubmit the form. So I just, excuse me, I don't want to have to deal with that. And there you see our dazzling demo of the text Hello World in the page. Okay, so the page loaded, the web part loaded, the web part said, oh, I need to go retrieve the contents of that HTML file, and I'm going to inject them into the page where our web part container is. All right, that's how that all worked. All right, now obviously that's not super valuable, so we're gonna just build iteratively on this demo to add more and more functionality to it. Okay, so one of the things we're going to be doing is doing some JavaScript programming. So I like to use Jquery when I'm doing these kinds of customizations. You don't have to use Jquery. It's completely up to you. I just like to use it. So I'm going to use, let's see here, Jquery 2. Actually, let me show you where I got this. Let's just go to open up a new tab, and let's search for Jquery Cdn. So there are several CDNs, or content delivery networks, that make Jquery available to you. So there's the Jquery one itself, which is the top one here in the search results. There's also this one, CDN.js. I happen to like this one. It's really up to you which one you use. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to use this one. And I like to use version 2.2.4. Again, it's just personal preference. So that's where I would get this, right? And you can see that the URL is cdn.js, cloudflare.com, Ajax, libs, Jquery 2.2.4. All right. So if I want to add that into my page, if I want to make use of that script, then I do that by adding in a script element or a script reference. Okay. So now Jquery is available to my page. I also want to add some custom script. So I'll add another script element, and I'll say that the type is equal to text JavaScript. Okay, and then what I can do is I can just use Jquery to inject Hello World into that div. So let's give the div an ID. We'll set the ID equal to message. And then we'll get rid of Hello World there. And then we'll tell jQuery when the page is ready. So the way you can do that, there's a couple different ways you do that. So you can just say jQuery. Let me do that, capitalize that correctly. jQuery. And then put a function in there. Or you can do jQuery.ready. That'll work as well. I'll just use jQuery here. And the parameter to it is a function. And this is the function that's going to run when the page is ready. So if you've done like ASP.NET web forms development, it's like the page load event. It's basically when the page is ready when I'm ready to interact with the page, run this script. Okay. And then I'm going to use jQuery to get a reference to the div tag with the ID message. So that's var msg is equal to jQuery. And then I put in what's called a selector. Okay, so the selector says, how am I going to identify the element or elements that I'm interested in? In this case, I'm going to do it by the ID. So the way you indicate that is using the pound sign. And then the ID of the element, which is message. Okay, so this selector indicates that I'm interested in this div. Actually, more specifically, that selector indicates that I'm interested in any element on the page that has an ID attribute whose value is message. So that's an important distinction to make, and it's one we'll talk about more a little bit later on in this stream. All right, so then what I want to do is I just want to set the inner text to hello world. So I'll say here msg dot text is equal to hello world. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and save that off. So if I've done everything correctly, as far as the user experience goes, it should be identical, right? Except for instead of us having the hello world text as part of the body of the div element, it's now being injected by JavaScript. So let's go back to here, and let me just change the order. I just happen to like this on the left. So I'll say upload files. I'll pick the updated version of our twitchdemo.html file. I'll click open. It'll ask if I want to replace the existing file, which I do. And then now if I just come over here and then press F5, we see we get exactly the same behavior. And just to make sure that it's actually, so instead of hello world, let's set it to hello Twitch, just to make sure it's not like using a cached version of the file or something like that. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. Let's come back over to our site assets, re-upload the file. And then again, press F5. And there you can see that the text has changed. Okay, so that is using jQuery and the jQuery ready function to interact with the page, do some JavaScript injection at the time the page is loaded. But there's a couple issues, a couple potential issues with this. And it's not so much with the jQuery ready function as the problem, but it's when we start adding other functions. There's a potential for, let's just do this. So let's go function foo here. And then function bar. Whoops, I got too many. I'm not sure why it's giving me a squiggly. Oh, because I didn't type it right. Function. There we go. Okay, so right now, foo and bar live off of the window object. Okay, so if I come over here and open up the, just press F12 to open up my developer tools, and then go to the console and type in window dot, you can see there's a lot of stuff off the window object. So the window object is kind of like the root object in JavaScript pages that contain JavaScript that are hosted in a web browser, right? And I'm saying hosted in a web browser because you can actually do JavaScript development on the server side using Node.js. Okay, but you can see, like, I was scrolling there the entire time I was talking, and I'm only down to the D's, right? So lots of stuff lives off of the window object. So if I have a function called foo and a function called bar, but somebody else who has some JavaScript that lives on the page that I'm using also have functions called foo or bar, or if I create variables, right? So var Rob and var Windsor, right? And they have variables called Rob and Windsor. We're going to have a naming collision, right? Unless either me or the other developer or developers or both of us use some kind of container so that those functions and those variables don't live off of the window object. They live local or inside of the container, right? So there's a pattern you can use to do this. And it's using what's called an IFI. And I can never remember what that acronym stands for. JavaScript IFI. Immediately invoked function expression. Okay. So all we're going to do with this IFI is basically make a container. So what I'll do here is I'll say, actually in braces, in round braces, right, function. And then it's going to end where parameters would go, right? So if this function happened to take parameters, x and y, I could put the values of those parameters here, right? But we're not doing that. We're not using this as a function. We're just using it as a container. Okay. So now let's take our jQuery ready method and cut it to the clipboard and paste it inside of this function. Okay. So now the jQuery ready function is local to the IFI, which means that it is not hanging off the window object. Okay. And the same thing, if I was to recreate the two variables and the two functions, they would be local to the IFI, which means they would not be hanging off the window object. So this enables me to have the functionality that I want, but to avoid the potential for naming collisions of variables and functions. And if I go ahead and save here and come back over to just close the developer tools here. And let's just, again, just so we know, whoops. Hello, Twitch 2, and save. So let's upload that. And replace. And then refresh. And there you go. Again, we see we have the same behavior, but now we've avoided potential for naming collisions in the JavaScript code we're going to have inside of our page, or sorry, our web part, really. Okay. Now, a couple other small things. I'm going to use the Office UI Fabric core. Basically, I'm just using this for styling information. So I just want the text to show bigger so I don't have to continually zoom in on it. So I'm going to link this style sheet. And it has a class I can use. So class is equal to, what's the syntax here? Okay, ms-font-xl. I haven't checked. I just grabbed this late because I thought it'd be easier if I could see the demos easier instead of me having to zoom constantly. I'm sure that this is not a recent version of what actually Office UI Fabric isn't really Office UI Fabric anymore. It's the Fluent framework. But that's neither here nor there. This is just really so you can see stuff easier. So it's not an important part of the demo. So let's just go ahead and upload that change. Okay, what did I do? Did I not save? I linked that. I set the class. That all looks right. All right, let's try that one more time here. Upload files, Twitch demo, replace. And I'll do a hard reset here, hard refresh. All right, let's see if that got applied. So I'll do an F12, and then I'll choose Elements, and then I'll choose to select that element, and we can see it is, oh, there's a typo. There's an equal sign where there should be a hyphen. That's what's causing the issue. So let's come back over here. There, that's where it is. So I'll save again. Come back here, upload files, Twitch demo, replace, and refresh. And there you go. You can see the text is quite a bit larger this time. And actually, for the purposes of this demo, maybe I can just go with XXL. We'll try that out and see if it, if we lose too much real estate. If we do, I'll bump it back down to XL. All right, so I think that's everything that I wanted to cover. Oh, no, there are a couple more things. Okay, so one is use strict. So this is optional. It's up to you whether you want to use it or not. But there are a few things you can do in JavaScript that are considered anti-practices, bad practices. And use strict just prevents those things from happening. So for example, using like global variables is an example that use strict prevents. So that's just something I generally throw into my code. And then also just to make sure that Jquery actually got loaded from the CDN. It's rare that it wouldn't, but like maybe there's a case where you're having spotty internet connection. I'm going to check to see whether or not Jquery is actually available to me, because otherwise I'm just going to get errors on the page. So I'll just check to see if the identifier Jquery is defined. Otherwise, I'll just alert the user that it wasn't loaded correctly, and I'm going to bail. Okay, so those are just a couple small things to do. Neither of them are necessary, but they're things I just like to put in my pages where I'm doing JavaScript injection. And then there's one last thing, and again, you don't have to do this, but it's something that I generally do because it has the potential to provide benefits with very little overhead. Or if you know you're going to be using the client object model, there's one case where I will be doing that later on in the demo in the stream. Then I suggest you do it. So every Classic page has a command that says delay load the client object model, right? Which load it on demand. So don't load it until you need it, right? So what we can do is we can indicate that we want it to be loaded before we go and do any work. Okay. And the way you do that is by calling, actually there's a couple different ways you can do that, but one of them is by calling this function execute or delay until script loaded. So basically wait until the script that you identify as the second parameter has been loaded and is available on the page. And the main library for the client object model is SPJS. Okay. So we're going to say in our jQuery function, wait until SPJS is loaded and then initialize the page. So that will become the function down here. Okay, so instead of this being the jQuery function, this function will become initialize page. And then it will update the message tag, right? So in our jQuery function, we say wait till the client object model is loaded, which it may already be, which means immediately the initialize page function runs. Or if it has to be loaded, then wait till it's loaded and available, and then run initialize page. Okay, so we can go ahead and save that. And again, we're going to see the same behavior here. And there we go. Okay, so this is the basic structure of the page, right? You're going to have your HTML. You don't have to have HTML. You can just have code. There's been a few customizations that I've built for classic sites that just have code. Those are more for DOM manipulation, which is a topic that I'll talk about at the very end, or towards the very end of the stream. But most of the customizations I'm building using the content editor web part, instead of modifying UI that's already rendered by SharePoint, I'm injecting new UI into the container for the content editor web part itself. Right? In this case, that UI is very simple. It's just a div tag and whatever content I inject into that div tag. But as we'll see, as we get through the stream, we'll be doing more and more sophisticated stuff, injecting more and more sophisticated user interface. Okay, so the next topic I want to talk about is scoping selectors. So the selector that I used to identify and get a handle to this div element is this selector right here. Now, if you use this syntax, what happens is any element on the page that has the ID message will get returned to you inside of an array. Okay. So that means that if I have an element that I created with the ID message, but somebody else elsewhere on the page has an element that they created that is an ID message, this will get both of them. And that's probably not what you want, right? So what you want to do is you want to scope your selectors to the actual content that you're injecting into the page, right? So to do that, I generally create if I'm going to have content, I do this in a container div. So let's do this. And then let's put the actual message div inside of the container div. And then let's set the class on the container. And then you give your container an ID that is long enough, and usually it's company or project specific. Right, so I work for a company called Pate Group, so I might start with Pate, and then whatever the project is or whatever the content that I'm putting in, but something that has a very, very low chance that somewhere else on the page there's an element with the same ID, right? So I'll just say here, my container element. It really doesn't matter. But again, I'm trying to create something. How about like here? There we go. This will be a good one. So we'll call it. Let's call it instead Twitch demo container. Okay. So again, a small chance that there's going to be something else on the page with that same ID. And then I'll create a variable that's available across the page called container that I use the jQuery selector to select it. Okay, so I'm selecting by ID. And then for all the elements that make up my actual user experience, I will scope the selectors to the container. So the way you do that is changing this to container.find. Right? So that says find the element whose ID is message that is inside of the element identified by container. Right? So that way, the elements that you create can have IDs that may not be unique across the entire page, but because you're scoping your selector to the container, then it's only going to find elements inside the container, right? So that, again, really what it's a very similar topic to what we talked about with using the IFI, so that we don't have naming collisions with variables and functions. In this case, we're using this technique to try to avoid issues with naming collisions of elements or things that identify elements. So those could be IDs, they could be class names, they could be attribute values. Anything that you would use a selector to try to find the information from. Okay, so a very simple technique that has a strong potential to eliminate errors that may or may not be obvious, right? So that's a simple thing. Let's talk about the context info next. So in any version of SharePoint, any development model in SharePoint, whether it's the server object model that had the SP context object, or the client object model, which has the client context object, or the SharePoint framework as a context object. The context object we use when doing JavaScript injection is an object that gets injected into the page by SharePoint. So let's come back over to our SharePoint page, and let's view source. And scroll down a bit. Let's see where if I can find this easy. There it is, there. Okay, so this object is called _SP page context info. And it has lots of information about the current context. So things like information about the current site collection, about the current site, about the current user, right? If you're on a list view, then about the list, right? If you're on a new page or an edit page, about the list item itself, right? Information about the current culture, information about, let's see, I'm trying to user, site collection, list item. Is there anything else? I think those are the main things. There might be something else in there too, but a culture, I think I said too. So we can use this to get information about the current context. All right, so let me just grab a snippet here that I've pre-created. And come over here and get rid of our hello Twitch 2 and replace it with this. Okay, and let me just reformat that and then zoom. Okay, so these are some of the values. Again, there's lots of values. These are just a very small subset of the values, but ones you use very, very commonly, right? So for example, if you want to find out the name of the current user, it's _SP page context info dot user display name. If you want to find out the current user's email, it's user email. The name of the current site is web title. There's the absolute URL to the current site. You can also get the relative URL to the current site. You can get the absolute URL to the current site collection, which is not shown here. There's the current culture name, so you can get both the current culture and the current UI culture. You can get the name, you can get the ID. Again, tons and tons of info. You know, is the current user a site collection admin or a site owner? Oh, another thing that the context will tell you is, are you running in SharePoint Online or not? So lots of different information that's available to you here, right? So if I get out of Zoom here and then go ahead and save and come back to our site assets library and upload the new version of our file. And then refresh. There you can see the current username, the current user email, the current site name, the current absolute site URL, and the current culture. So the next thing we want to do is actually get data out of SharePoint. And we're going to use the attribute or property of the underscore SP page context info to be able to identify what site we want to run a REST API query on. Okay, so I'm going to use the REST API in this example. I could absolutely use the client object model, right? We've loaded the client object model. It's there. It's available for us. So if you feel more comfortable using the client object model, you absolutely can. I personally think that when doing JavaScript injection, it's easier to use the REST API, but that's a personal choice. So again, whatever you feel most comfortable with, that's perfectly fine. All right, so I'm going to add in this helper method to make a GET request. That's retrieve information from SharePoint. Because every time you do this, almost all of the setup that you do is exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to be using Jquery. More specifically, I'm going to be using the Ajax method that's part of Jquery to make the REST API call. That's not necessary. You can use the native JavaScript support. The XP HTTP request. That doesn't sound right, but something close to that. There's other libraries you can use to make calls out to REST-based web services. I've already loaded Jquery on the page. I know how to use Jquery Ajax, so that's what I'm going to be using. So we're going to need a URL, and our code will construct this URL. Okay, so that's the URL that identifies what information we want to retrieve in this case, or the value, the field values if we're creating an item or updating an item. The type of request. This is a GET request saying I want to retrieve information from SharePoint. We can do a post, which is an update, or a put, which is, a post is an add, a put is an update, or a delete, which is a delete. The data type I'll be getting back is JSON. I don't want the results to be cached. And then I need to add in some headers here, which indicates the format or the schema of the JSON that will come back. Okay, so in this case, I'm saying that I want minimal metadata. That's identified up here. So I'm using the OData v3 format with the minimal metadata. That's also this option is in general referred to as JSON Lite. It's a smaller payload that has all the data but none of the extra or information, the metadata about the data, which I don't particularly need in this example. Okay, so this sets up everything I need to do to make a REST API call. Now, what am I going to get? Let's get information about categories. All right, so I have a list inside of my SharePoint site called categories. So you can see there are several categories. They have a title, an ID, and a description. So we're just going to use the title. So there's beverages, condiments, confections, dairy products, grains and cereals, and so on. All right, so let's come over here and let's create a new function. And I'll call this get categories. So I'll say here var URL is equal to And when you bring in the client object model, you get this function called string.format. It's from the Microsoft.Ajax library, so I like to use that. It just makes the construction of this stuff a little bit easier. Easier to read, cleaner, I think. So I'm going to need the absolute URL to the current site. So that'll be the first parameter. And of course, I need to spell this correctly, not format. And then it's underscore API / web / lists / get by title. So / list gives me the collection of all lists in the current site. Get by title says I want to get a specific list. I want to get the categories list. Okay, and I want the items from that list. And I want the items returned to me in alphabetical order. So I'll add in an OData query parameter, which is $order by is equal to title. And then I need to specify the value of the parameter that I put there. And that is underscore SP page context info .web absolute URL. Okay, so the absolute URL to the current SharePoint site. Okay, so that's the URL that I'm going to use to identify that I want to get back the items in the categories list ordered by title. Right? And then I can go ahead and kick off the asynchronous call that will make the REST API query and return the results to me. So I'm going to say here var call is equal to REST API get, passing in that URL. Okay, that's going to return me a jQuery promise object, and then I can say call.done, and call.done. This takes a function as a parameter. That function will receive the data that's coming back. So this is the callback if the REST API call was a success. And now I can go ahead and let's just grab this variable for the message. So we'll cut that here and paste it over here. And now I want to iterate over the data that came back because we have multiple categories. So the data object will have a property called value, and that will be an array of objects which represent each of the categories. Okay, so I'm going to for each over that. And for each takes a function, and the parameter of that function is the individual items in the collection or the array. So that will be a category. And then what I want to do is append to the inject the information about that particular category into the div element identified by the message variable here. But before I do that, let me just say here message.html is going to be the value. Let me just initialize that to categories. Categories. Semicolon, then I'll add a break tag. Okay, and then for each of the categories, I'll say message.append, and I'll append the category title. So it's the value of the title field. And then I need another break tag. And that should be good. So in our initialized page, I want to call get categories. That's going to construct the URL for the REST API call. It's going to make or kick off the REST API call, wait for it to come back, and then if that call succeeds, we'll iterate over the objects representing each category that come back, and we'll put them on the page. Excuse me. We also want to handle an error. So in jQuery promises, that is a property called fail. So if the call fails, we'll get this object back called the JQXHR. It'll have a property called response text, which will contain the error message. So we'll just alert that out to the user. Okay, so if this is all correct, we should now see a list of categories on the page when we update our source code. And then go ahead and refresh. And there we do. Okay. So, so this is an example of using JavaScript injection to go query information from SharePoint and then render that on the page. Now, that's cool, but what happens if we want to have some kind of interactivity, right? So maybe what I want to do is I want to have a drop-down which shows the categories. And then when the user selects a category, we want to show products associated with that category. So we have a list called products, which has a lookup on categories. So what we can do is we can populate the dropdown with the names of the categories and their IDs. And then when the user selects a category, we can do a query to go get the products that have that category value. Okay. So let's set that up. So over here in our actually, let's just add a function first. So let me copy and paste this. And I'm going to call this get products. So now instead of getting items from the categories list, we're going to get items from the products list. And we're going to need a filter query. So, so we'll have the order by still. We're going to add in a second query string parameter to this, which will be $filter, which is equal to the category ID. So in the REST API, if I have a field called category, right? When I say field, you can think if a column on a list and a field on a list, they're synonyms. So if the name of the field is category, then there is a property called category ID, which is the ID of the item in the lookup list, right? So beverages, let's again just go here and open up categories. Okay, so the category ID for beverages is 1. So for this item, the category ID value would be 1, right? The list item ID in the categories list for condiments is 2. So the category ID for this item would be 2, and so on, right? So that's how you interact with lookups fields in the REST API. There's other ways to do this through what's called an expand, which is a little bit out of the scope of this particular session, but for the basics there. So in our filter, we're going to say where the category ID is equal to, and then we'll have a parameter. Okay. And we'll use the value, the ID of the selected item by the user to populate that parameter, and we'll do that in just a sec. Okay, so then instead of categories, we're going to show products. We're going to show the title of the project, so this doesn't need to change, although we should change this to product rather than category. So let's do that. And I think everything else stays the same. Cool. All right, so what we want to do now is we want to update our UI so that we have a drop-down. We'll populate that drop-down. So instead of you having to watch me type all this stuff out, let me just grab some pre-prepared stuff. Okay, So I'm going to have a div that is a label category and then a select. And we're going to call that select category select. Right? And then down here in our code now for get categories, instead of populating the message element, we'll populate the select. Okay, so that'll be var select is equal to the selector scoped to the container for the element whose ID is category select. And then we're going to iterate over each of the elements and put them in the select. And that code looks like this. Let me just do a Alt-Shift-F to format. Okay, so for each category, we're going to create a new option element, right? So that's an option inside of a select. The value for the option will be the ID of the item in the categories list, and the text will be the title. And then we're going to append that option into the select. We're going to inject it. All right, so that'll populate the select for us. Then what we need to do is to attach an event handler to that. So that is, there's two ways you can do this. You can do select.change, which is the old, the sort of legacy way to do it. Or you can do select.on and then indicate that the event you're looking for is the change event. Okay, either one of those will work. And then we need to say what function do we want to call when the select changes. Okay, so we can go ahead and actually let's not call it get products. Let me just do some refactoring here. So I'm going to use a naming convention that I generally use, which will be category select change. So it's the name of the element followed by the name of the event. Right. So when the change event happens, call the category select change function. Right. So let's go ahead and add that. So function categories. Whoops. Try that again. Category select change. This receives an object which represents the event that occurred. We're not going to use that, but I'll just mention it for the purposes of the demo. So now what we want to do is we want to get the ID of the selected element, right? So to do that, again, we'll go ahead and get reference to the select element. So that's the same selector we had before. And then we can say here var category ID is equal to select.val. Right? So select.val says give me the ID or the value, sorry, actually more the value of the value attribute for the selected element, which is going to be the ID of the category. Okay? So let's just change this function here from get products to get products by category, and then have it receive a parameter called category ID. And then that will be the second parameter here to our string.format, so that this gets populated with the actual category ID value. Okay, so now we can go ahead in here in our select and call get products by category, passing in the category ID value that we retrieved right there. All right. My apologies. All right, so I think there's one other thing we need to change, but I'll do that in a second. We're missing a semicolon there. So let's go ahead and save here. And then let's go ahead and upload that file. and then refresh. Okay, so there's our categories. And if I choose a category, you can see the items, the products that are associated with that category. Okay, now let me refresh the page one more time here. Notice that the dropdown gets, an item is chosen, but we don't actually see the products. So that's an easy fix. We can just call the function here so that it populates the products for the item that's selected in the dropdown on the page load. So let's go ahead and make that, save that change. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So now we have more of a user experience, right? So we have the drop down populated. We can show the products. Let's get a little bit more complex here. So one of the things I want to do is I don't like, well, it's a simple demo. And we already got quite a bit of code here in our web part. I kind of like to split the files up. I like to split the responsibilities of the files. So we have some data access code mixed in with our user experience code. I would like to kind of pull that data access code out of here and have it be somewhere else, right? So let's create a new file in the Twitch folder. We'll call this products service. Normally, I'd actually have multiple files, but for the purposes of the demo, I'm just going to do one file. Okay. Just give me a second. I need to readjust my chair here. Okay, better. And now I need a container. Or, sorry, just like before, I need a container. But in this case, the iffy function isn't going to solve the problem that I want. So I need to use a different technique to create a container. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use objects, JavaScript objects, to emulate namespaces and classes. So I'm going to say here, window.demo is equal to window.demo, or it's an empty object. Okay, and then I'll say window.demo.services is equal to window.demo.services, or it's an empty object. Okay. Not Windows, window. So this says, create something that is going to emulate a namespace called demo, right? And if it already exists, just use it, right? So if we have lots of files, it's possible that that namespace got created somewhere else, right? So if it already exists, use it. Otherwise, just initialize it to an empty object, right? And then create a sub namespace called services, which if it already exists, use it. Otherwise, use an empty object. And then I'm going to create a class. So it's demo.services. That's the name. That's the simulated namespace, right? Dot product service is equal to function. Okay, so this function, which will be contained inside of actually this object right here. So it won't be off of the window object. It'll be contained to that object. Will represent the constructor for a class. Okay. And then what I want to do is put my data access code inside of this class. So first off, we'll go and get that helper method for the REST API get, and we'll pull that out. So I'll do Control X here. And then inside of the function, I'll do Control V. Okay, so there's REST API get. And then we want the get categories. So I'll just copy this entire function here. And I really only need the first bit. So I can get rid of all of that. And then I'm going to say, instead of call equal to that, I'm just going to say return. Okay, and then I need the get products by category. Again, I'll copy all of that. Okay, I'll Shift F to reformat. And just like before, I need to return that promise that's generated by the REST API get function. Okay, so there's my service. Now, these methods, get categories, get products by category, and REST API get, are all local to the constructor, right? So right now they're not visible outside the class. The way I make them visible outside the class is by returning a literal object that exposes them. Okay, so at the end of this, I'm going to say return. This is the end of the constructor. I'm going to return a property called get categories, which exposes the get categories function. And I'm going to return a property called get products by category, which returns the get products by category function. Okay. So now when I create an instance of product service, the constructor will run, and it will make those two functions available for me. Right. All right. So now what I need to do is figure out how to reference product service JS. Right. So you might think, well, that's pretty simple, right? Product service JS is in the same file, sorry, the same folder on disk as this file. So I can just go product service JS, right? Product service JS. That should work. But this isn't an HTML page. This is a web part that's hosted in another page, right? So this file lives in the the site assets library, but the page actually lives in the site pages library. So product service isn't in site pages, it's in site assets, so that it won't be able to find the file. Okay, so what I could do is I could go, okay, well, hold on. So site pages, let's go back. That's going to be the libraries, and then it's going to be site assets. And then I think that's right. So that should be the relative path from the page hosted in the site pages library to the product service in site assets. Unless this script is going to run in a subsite rather than in the root site, but the libraries are going to live in the site assets, which is in the root site. Ugh. You know, so this, you can use relative pathing. I don't like it, right? So I don't like to use that technique. So then another option is to just we know that this is going to be in the root site collection, or sorry, the root site of the site collection. So what I could do is just hard code in the URL, right? So I could just do this. And that would work. Sorry, actually, I need to put in the folder names. I forgot that. So it'd be like Twitch demo product service JS. No, let's just do it. Twitch demo product service JS. Okay. So that will work, assuming that I'm doing development on the same servers where this is going to get deployed. Right. So basically, I'm doing development in production instead of doing development on a developer tenant. So if I'm doing development on a developer tenant, then when I go to deploy this, I need to then change that URL to the URL of the production site collection, which I don't really want to do. Okay, so the technique that I use to load other files is to use the Jquery getScript function. And again, sorry, I need to just readjust my chair here. I'm having a little bit, some issues with it staying elevated, which I may have to end up buying a new chair, which I'm not looking forward to, but life goes on. So how do we do that? Well, it looks like this. And there's too much typing here for me to do this. So I'm just going to grab some code here. It looks like that. And it goes here. Okay. So I'm going to use Jquery getScript, passing in the absolute URL to the current site. And I'm using web absolute URL. That's actually a bug. Not a bug. It could potentially be a bug, right? Because if it's a subsite, the absolute URL to the current site, the web absolute URL, is the subsite, not the root site, right? So what I want, sorry, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do this, view source. And then scroll down here, page context info. It is site absolute URL, I believe. Let's do a find on that. Site absolute URL. There it is. Yep. Okay, that's the URL to the root site of the site collection. So that's what I want, right? Because regardless of whether we're in the root site or a subsite, the site assets library is in the root, so this product service JS is going to be in the root. Okay, and it's not in a folder called injection; it's in a folder called Twitch demo. Okay, so getScript is specifically designed to get and load JavaScript files. It is an asynchronous call. So what we're going to do is we're going to execute and delay till the client object model is loaded. Once that's done, we'll call load additional scripts. And then when that's done, then we'll call initialize page. Okay. So that should make the product service JS, the contents of that, available to us. So now we can go ahead here and modify this code. So get categories. We are no longer directly calling this. We're going to say here var service is equal to new. I don't really need to use new here, but I just like to do it because it indicates to me I'm creating an instance of an object. So it's demo. Now, unfortunately, in Visual Studio Code, we don't get IntelliSense. Okay. In full Visual Studio, you could use these things called script references. They're also known as / references, which indicate to Visual Studio that there's a library out there that you're using for which you would like IntelliSense. If you can do the same thing with Visual Studio Code, but it requires the use of Node and NPM. And I have Node installed. I could do it, but I don't want to introduce that process into this demo because I think it just adds complexity, which is not needed. But the drawback is that I'm losing IntelliSense. Okay, so it's a trade-off that I'm okay with in this particular case. So let me open up the product service file. So I'm just going to grab the name of the class here, put it on the clipboard, and then come back over here. So I'm going to create a new demo.services.productService. Okay, and then I'm going to say here var call is equal to SVC, that's the class instance, dot get categories. Did it actually give me IntelliSense there, or is that just because I've used that in a yeah, I don't think that's actually. I think that's just a guess, not actual IntelliSense there. Okay, so let's get categories, and then now we want to do the same thing for get products. Okay. So now it's not get categories, it's get products by category. It's giving me IntelliSense because of this function exists there. And then passing in the category ID. Okay. So now all of the data access bits are being done inside a product service, and then all of the UI bits are being done in our web part. Right? So again, we're using jQuery getScript to load the script. Then we're just creating an instance of the object and calling a method off of the object. Right? And we have our data access code off in a different file. All right, so if that is all working correctly, then I should be able to come over here and do an upload of both of the files. And one of them will get replaced. Okay, and then come here and refresh. And there we go. Okay, so now we have the same user experience, but the data access code has been separated out from the user experience code. Okay, so whether you have a single file or multiple files, you can use this technique. The syntax here is a little bit different. You need to use what's called a jQuery when to make multiple calls to load the multiple scripts. It's a very small change. It's not daunting. But it is a slight difference in the syntax. But the important thing is now if I go ahead and deploy this out to a client, because it's going to be site absolute URL will be the absolute URL to the site where this is being hosted. This will continue to work. Same thing with the web absolute URL. When I do the REST API calls, is whatever the current site is. So as long as the products list and the categories list live in the current site where the web part is being hosted, then it will all work correctly. And if I wanted the web part here to work, whether it's in the root site or a subsite, even if the list exists in the root site, I could just change web absolute URL to site absolute URL, right? So that's an easy change, and this will still work. So just knowing techniques you can use to not hard code specifics about the site or the tenant or the farm that you're in, the more reusable your code is going to be and the less prone it will be to errors. Okay, so that's separating out some code and using what I call an internal library, right? Just basically it's another JavaScript file. But what if I want to use an external library, a third-party library? So one of the ones that I like to use in my JavaScript injection or content editor web part customizations is one called data tables. Okay, so it's datatables.net, and you can use it to show data, tabular data, in a nice form that you can search. It has paging, right? There's lots of different functionality that's available to it. Okay, so let's modify our code. So instead of just writing out the names of the products, we'll actually use data tables to render the product data. Okay. So this requires several changes. The first thing I'm going to do, and this is all on the data tables website, is I'm going to link to their style sheet. Okay. So again, I'm getting the style sheet from the Cloudflare CDN, and it's data tables version 1.10.16. So data table is jQuery UI min CSS. And then I need the jQuery library itself. Sorry, not the jQuery library. The data tables library. So I'll put that down here. Okay, again, it's available. There's a data table CDN. There's other CDNs you can get this from. But it's jQuery.datatables.min.js. I should point out that data tables does have a dependency on Jquery. It's a Jquery plugin, so you do have to have Jquery if you're going to use data tables. And then I'll put the base UI, right, for our table. So instead of having our message element, I'm going to have a table element. So its ID is going to be products table. The class display is part of data tables. You'll see that in the docs. It says for the table that you're going to use, set the class to display. And then I indicate the headers for the different columns. And I give it an empty table body, right? And the data tables library will populate that table body. Okay, so now what I need to do is just add in some code. So down here, where I currently was populating the message element with the titles of the products, I'm going to replace that with code to populate the data table. Okay, and that code looks like this. So I'm going to use the container to find the element inside the container whose ID is products table. Oh, that is not the right code. Shoot. That's some old code. Let me go get the right code. External libraries. This is the right code here. So let me just grab that and update that. Cool. And I also want to update that and save. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is just transform the data that comes back. So one of the values I'm going to get back is a dollar amount. So it's going to come back just as a number. So if the dollar value is 8, I'll just get back 8 rather than, $800. So I'm just going to add in a dollar sign, and this obviously is hard coded to North American or any place that uses dollars as currency. And then 2 decimal places, right? So it'll be the number and then a decimal place and then 2 values. Okay, so if those values are zeros, they'll both be zeros. If there's a cent component to the dollar value, then that will be shown there as well. Right? So that's just basically a formatting thing. So the map function takes in an array and gives you back a new array. So I'm going to store that in a variable called table data. Okay. And then I will use the data table function here to populate the data table. So destroy is equal to true says when I re-render, destroy the existing table and recreate it. The data that's going to be populated is the table data. That's the data I just showed you a second ago. Auto width says let the data tables figure out the width of every column. I turn paging off just so we can see all the items because I think the most products there are for an individual category is 12. So I don't really need paging. And then I define the columns. So the first column is going to be the item in the products list. The field value for title of the items in the products list. The second one is going to be the quantity per unit field value. The third one is the unit price field value. Then in units in stock and then units on order. Okay, so these are the internal names of the fields here. And let me try that again. Right. And then the class name just to indicate whether or not the value should be left justified or right justified in the table. Right. So add in the style sheet for data tables, add in a reference to the library, give the base UI, and then use the data tables library to populate the table. Okay, so if I've done everything correctly, we should see a change to our user experience. Oh, there is one more change I want to make. I just want to give more space between the drop-down and the table. So let me just change this to 50 pixels. Okay, and now come over here, upload our Twitch demo file, and replace. And then refresh here. And then now we can see our products in a nice table, right? And if I change the category, we see the products table update with the products for that category. Okay, now, I don't know if we can see it here. Let me try it again. Yeah, notice when I refresh, there is a slight delay between the time the page refreshes and the time the UI shows. And that's because we're loading the library and we're making the 2 REST API calls. Okay. So if you're loading lots of libraries or lots of data, then there can be a noticeable delay. So you want to have some kind of visual indication that the page is loading, right, to the user. So the client object model actually provides a method which enables you to do that quite easily. So let's come over here. Let's create a new variable to hold a reference to the dialog that's going to show that the page is loading. So it's called wait dialog, right? And then grab this. So this is part of the client object model. So I have to wait until that's loaded. So here in load additional scripts, I'll just add in this call. So it is sp.ui.modal.dialog.show wait screen with no close. And the text that's going to show on that is loading page. And it's going to give me back an ID for the dialog, which I can then use to close it later on. Okay, so that'll be stored in the wait dialog variable. And then I can just add in some code. So any place where we want the wait dialog to close, I'll use that code. So here, if there's an error message, I want to close the wait dialog and set the wait dialog variable back to null. And let's see, get categories with the products. So once we've had a successful call to the get products, I want to make sure I close the wait dialog and set it to null. And if that fails, I want to do the same thing. Okay, and let me just clean up those spaces there. All right, so let's go ahead and save. And I hope this comes through on the stream. I can actually force a delay if need be. But let's see here. So refresh. Yeah, there you see the loading page with the spinny, and then there the page loads. Okay, so it's a very simple way, just by using a class that's part of the client object model, to give the user some indication that the page is doing something in the background. It's not just hung. Okay, and then I could also update the UI to, like, just have a panel show up. There's lots of different ways to indicate a loading screen, but you should have some kind of visual cue or clue to the user that something is happening behind the scenes, and that's why they're not seeing the UI. Right. So that client object model method is an easy way to do that. All right. So the last thing I want to show you in terms of working with a web part page, basically using JavaScript and a content editor and a web part page, and all web part pages are classic pages. I should have probably specified that, right? So is to do DOM manipulation, right? So DOM manipulation means that you are, instead of injecting new user experience into the web part, that you're using the JavaScript to modify some of the stuff that SharePoint provides for you out of the box. Okay. This was and is a very common practice in Classic pages. Okay. And geez, since SharePoint 2013, there have only been a handful of incidents where Microsoft has changed the way the DOM is the DOM elements are generated for given UI elements. Okay. There was one really big breaking one, but in the last 7 years, there's been one major breaking one that I can think of. Okay. So doing DOM manipulation in Classic pages is a relatively safe thing to do. You can never say that it's absolutely safe, but it's relatively safe. And again, it is a pretty common practice. So I'm going to show you a very simple example of doing DOM manipulation, but there's lots of different things, very sophisticated things you can do to modify the UI that SharePoint provides for you. So the example I'm going to give is just hiding the left-hand nav. All right, so let's go open up our developer tools. I'll press F12. And then in the Elements tab, I'll choose Select Element, and I'll come up here and choose that. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to find an element in this tree that represents the root of the left-hand navigation. And there's a couple of them. I think this is a safe one to use here. The delta placeholder left nav bar. This one is potential, but, whoops, sorry. Let's try that again. But any element that has like some kind of weird characters in it, like ZZ or ZZ11 underscore, it probably means that that ID was generated, and the chances that that ID might change, there are chances that that ID might change. Whereas delta placeholder left nav bar is not generated. It's a hard-coded value. And as long as the left-hand nav is generated in the same way as it has been for the last 7 years, that ID is not going to change. So that's the one I would suggest you use. You can confirm that that would be a good one to use just by hovering over it, and you can see that it shows you what is contained in that element. Okay, so that is what I want to get removed. So we're going to use delta placeholder left nav bar. Okay, so let's go to our initialized page. Let's put it in there. So I'm going to say here var left nav is equal to, and in this case I can't use my container because I want to get an element that's outside of the container, right? So it is pound, delta, I can't remember what it is, so I'm going to cheat. Hopefully you will not think less of me for doing so. So there we go, left delta placeholder left nav bar. And then we can just use jQuery to say left nav dot hide. Okay, so Control S and come back over to here, site asset, sorry. Upload the updated file. And then come back to here, just close the developer panel. And there you go. Now, notice when I refresh, the left nav shows for a very short amount of time, then it goes away. Okay, so where you put the code to hide or do the DOM manipulation is important. I'm waiting until after the scripts have been loaded and after the client object model has been loaded. But I don't need either of those things to be loaded to do this DOM manipulation. So let's get it out of here and put it right up here in our jQuery ready function. And save. Okay, so upload files and replace. Okay, and now refresh. And now you don't see the left-hand nav at all. Okay, so if you are hiding elements that are already on the page, or you're modifying elements that are already on the page, what you want to try to avoid is those elements showing up and then disappearing, or showing up and then changing, because that definitely can be confusing to your users. Okay, so when you're doing DOM manipulation, unless everything's just completely additive to, like, in an area that's not necessarily being used or the user would not be looking at, then you want to try to do it as early in the page lifecycle as possible to avoid any kind of flicker or changing anything that potentially could be confusing to a user. Okay. Now, I've talked about DOM manipulation in classic pages. Microsoft has been very explicit that you should not do DOM manipulation in modern pages. And unlike classic pages, where the DOM of the page, the HTML structure and the CSS has been virtually static since 2013, sorry. The modern page DOM changes regularly. So if you rely on an element with a specific ID or a specific class name, the chances that that element will be in the same container or have the same class name or have the same ID for any length of time is not great. So I strongly suggest that you think long and hard about doing any kind of customizations in a modern page using DOM manipulation. I've personally done it, I think, twice. Once for sure. I think I've actually done it twice for clients, with very, very explicit provisos that this, I'm only doing it because it's the only way to get this UI changed, but it will break. And the one I have done, I think I've had to change 3 times because it's broken 3 times because of changes to the underlying DOM. Right, but the client was aware of that and they were willing to live with that, right? But otherwise, again, if it's an option of last resort to go and do that. Now that implies, if I'm saying that I'm using DOM manipulation on a modern page, that implies that I'm somehow doing JavaScript injection into a modern page, and there are ways to do that. Now, in modern pages, there is no script editor or content editor web part from Microsoft. Okay, but because sometimes this technique, you can do a very, very quick customization that doesn't necessarily need the power of the SharePoint framework, and also the overhead involved in creating a SharePoint framework web part, and then creating a package, and then deploying that package to the app catalog, and potentially having to have an administrator do that, right? There are some places where you can do very simple customizations just using a content editor or script editor. And as long as you do it as long as you're educated about what you're doing, I think that there are cases where it makes sense to do that. Okay, but as I mentioned, there is no modern content editor or script editor, so how do you do it if you want to? So you can Google for, and unfortunately, I think that the blog post that it identifies this. Well, actually, let's just try modern script editor. How about SharePoint modern script editor web part? There we go. Okay, this is not updated modern script. Okay. So there was a gentleman, there still is a gentleman named Michael Svensson, who is now part of Microsoft, although he wasn't when he wrote this script editor web part for modern pages. So he did a blog post this is an update to it, but the original blog post was called perhaps the only SharePoint web part you will ever need, I believe. Perhaps the only SharePoint framework web part you will need. Okay, so this is Michael's original blog post where he talks about this modern version of the script editor web part that he created, right? And I looked at it and said, "Oh, that's really cool," but I don't like using the script editor web part. I prefer to use the content editor web part. So I took the underlying implementation that Michael had, and I wrote a content editor version. So this blog post talks about how it works. Okay, so it's entitled, perhaps the only other SharePoint framework web part you'll ever need, right? So I'll show you how to use that. Now, one of the things, there's a few things I did. I made sure in a modern page, it doesn't, unlike a classic page, it doesn't have the functionality to make the client object model load on demand. Okay, so the web part that I built loads the client object model for you, so it's just available to you, right? Modern pages in SharePoint Online don't have an _sp page context info object, so I injected that into the page, right? So I try to do as many things as possible with the web part so that the experience would be as close to the classic content editor web part as possible. Okay, so if I go to my app catalog here, app catalog, if I spell it correctly, it will help a lot. Catalog. And then go to apps for SharePoint. I have already uploaded the SharePoint framework package that implements the content editor web part. Okay. So now, and I've also configured it so that the web part is available in any site collection. Okay, so let's go, this is a modern site collection here. So let's go to the pages library. And let's create a new site page. That's a modern page. So we'll call this Twitch Demo Modern. And I don't need the author name there. And I don't need a graphic. And I want to open up the web part toolbox and find SPFX Content Editor. And then I'll open up the property pane and set the content link. So it's the same content link as this guy. Actually, let me just type it in. So it's the site assets / Twitch demo / Twitch demo.html. Okay, apply. And go ahead and publish. Okay, so F5 to let's just refresh. Okay, so it's not working. So let's F12 here and go to the console. Okay, show wait screen with no close. So the library that's part of the client object model, my web part doesn't load that specific library. Either that or show wait screen with no close is not supported on modern pages. It's one of the two things, right? So that's a simple fix. So we're just going to comment out that, and we can use. There's a different technique we can use specifically for modern web parts, client-side web parts. So We're just going to comment that out. And actually, let's comment out this code too, because there is no left-hand nav. So even though this code isn't really doing anything, we can still just comment it out. All right, so let's save that. And then come back over here and upload. Okay, and then refresh. And now you can see that our page is working as expected. The only thing is the UI here is a little bit different, right? The size of the dropdown isn't as large as I'd like it to be, but that's a simple CSS change. Okay. So, so you can use the content editor in a modern page using either the script editor written by Michael Svensson or the content editor that I have that's based on the code that Michael wrote. Again, I think there are certain scenarios where it's valuable, but my first inclination would be to say, okay, does it make sense for us to use the SharePoint framework, right? If it's a very, very simple customization, then it might make sense to use the script editor or the content editor. Otherwise, I would stick with the SharePoint framework, right? Microsoft didn't include the script editor or content editor web parts for a reason. The reasoning behind that is a little bit long to get into in this particular session, and I've already actually gone almost 2 hours, so I think it's a good time to finish up. But I just wanted to make you aware that those things are available to you should you want to use them. Okay, so that's everything I had for this particular session. Let me go back to the screen here. So the plan is, oh, sorry, before I do that, let me just, when I do demos like this, I want to start making the code available. So the code for my last session is available. You can find the link to it in the YouTube channel, but I'll just show you here. If I go to my GitHub repo, and search for, in this case, Classic. Okay, so this is the link to the repo with all the demos. So it's github.com/rob-windsor/rw-classic-javascript-injection. Okay, I want to do some more cleanup on the repo. So I want to put some README files in here and so on. But the demo code is all there. And if you, for my last, for last week, it is this one. So last week I talked about the property pane. So there's all the demos that I showed last week in my Twitch stream on working with the SharePoint Framework web parts and the property pane. Right, so that's going to be where it makes sense. Some of the streams I'm going to do, it won't make sense to have the code repos, but where it does make sense, I will be having that. And I'll make sure that I put links to that in the description for the VOD on Twitch and also for the recording that I put up on YouTube. All right, so that's it for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Whether you watched online on Twitch, the live stream, or whether you're watching the VOD on Twitch or the recording on my YouTube channel. Let me now go to here. I talked about my YouTube channel, so that's youtube.com/users/TorontoGeek. That's my YouTube channel. Hopefully you have the link to my Twitch stream if you're watching it. But it's twitch.tv/RobWindsor06. And also in the bottom right, you can see my Twitter handle @RobWindsor. That's the easiest way to communicate with me, is to just tweet me. So if you have suggestions for future topics, I'd love to hear them. Also, if you have any questions related to the content that I've shown, I'm happy to try to answer those. Generally for questions, my preference is that you put them on either Stack Overflow or the SharePoint Stack Exchange, and then just send me a link. That way, if I can't answer the question, there's a good chance that somebody else can. And also, everybody gets the value out of the answers rather than just yourself. Okay, so that's again my preference there. So I hope to see you again either next Thursday or in one of my future streams. Hope you have a great weekend. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.